This is the number one downloaded episode of 2023. What a beautiful season of growth, of change that I have been able to walk through with so many guests, so many of you writing in, so many comments, and I truly can't thank you enough. What I found so most interesting is that the majority of those most listened to podcasts were things that were just conversations between you and I, much like this one. This episode is your brain hijacking your life through triggers? I hope that you learned. I hope that you continue to hear something that really helps support your growth right here on the podcast. Next year, which is weird to say, we'll be doing a little bit something different. While everything will still be focused around self-love and growth, I'll also be bringing in many of the things that I hear every single day in private session that people say, wow, I wish I would have learned that sooner. My goal is to help accelerate your growth, give you a grounded space, and really help you take command and authority of your life. Number one episode of 2023. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for being such a valuable part of this community, of my life, of this growth project, which is a passion project for me. On to the episode. Hey everyone, welcome to the Get Your Life Together Girl podcast, the ultimate blueprint to self-love and inner peace. I'm your host, Danielle Van. As a cognitive behavioral therapist, a life coach to women, meditation teacher, and author, I've spent my life studying and learning from the stories that make us human. It's my passion and goal to help you shift your mindset and create a lifelong revolution to help you reach your greatest potential. Over the last few years, words such as trigger, emotional hijacking, safety, awareness, and growth have been blowing up social media and inside personal development and self-help books. These buzzwords have even found their way into this podcast and most certainly into private sessions. And rightfully so, but most do not realize that these words, or better yet actions, all tie back to one central place in our bodies, our brains. As we navigate the world around us, our brain is always actively working to keep us safe. Safe from danger, our past, and our triggers. And in doing so, your brain can literally hijack moments or your life. So today we're taking a one-on-one deep dive into why our brain is always on the lookout for trouble, how to stop being hijacked in hopes of providing a false sense of safety, and we're going to break down how to disentangle ourselves from our earliest patterns, our triggers. This is a big conversation that will shed light on why we may be causing ourselves more issues than you realize. So let's dive right in. The Get Your Life Together Girl podcast starts right now. Are you ready for a huge conversation? I don't even know where we should start. I feel like I talk more about safety than I do self-love or inner peace, and perhaps that's because without safety, neither of those can actually exist. And let's face it, when safety doesn't exist for us, that's generally because your brain has perceived a threat of some kind, whether emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, or even financially. And because of this perceived threat, our body and mind goes on lockdown. Your brain is incredibly complex. But I know you already know that. In case you haven't heard me talk about the brain before, I call it the supercomputer of the body. The reason why I call it the supercomputer is because it's responsible for so much. How much? Well, your brain is responsible for problem solving, emotional traits, reasoning and judgment, speaking, voluntary activity, knowing directions, sensations, reading, body orientation, vision and color perception, understanding language, behavior, memory. Stick with me because this list is kind of long. It's responsible for balance and coordination, fine motor control, breathing, body temperature, digestion, alertness, sleepiness, swallowing. we haven't even gotten to the behavior or emotional elements yet. That could take another hour, and let's just say we don't have time for it. But you get it. The supercomputer is busy with everything from making your heart beat to your unique personality. It literally does not spend one moment without a task. Does that thought make anyone else exhausted? Just to think about how much is going on in that brain of yours at all times. No, just me? All right. All right. But when your brain is not working optimally, we tend to fall into our own personal traps. The trap of reaction, triggers, rumination, emotional deregulation. And if you listen to last week's podcast, psychotherapist Britt Frank described it as your brain literally being on fire. I love that image because it's so on point to what happens when the supercomputer is filled with a thought, a feeling, or a physical virus, right? Meaning it's not working for us, that kind of virus. And it's here that you begin to hijack the good of your life, generally without even trying. So that's what we're talking about today is how do we get out of that? And what the hell is going on? This is something that when women come into my office, they're really confused as to why they are continually in this cycle of response, reaction, and really never having full emotional control. And when we break this down, everyone says, I get it. And then the steps to get there are, practicing and putting in some hard work. So I'm going to give those to you later. Now, hear me out. I love brain science. So I'm going to do my best not to nerd out on you right now and stick to the old KISS method that I learned when I was a kid. Keep it simple, stupid. Okay, so your brain is made up of many different parts. I think you know that. And I'm pretty sure you've heard terms like amygdala, frontal lobe, cortex. And right now, we're going to laser our focus into the amygdala. This, my friend, is the oldest and most primal part of your brain. It's also the part that's constantly scanning the world, trying to keep you safe and alerting you to trouble. It's that whole example of the caveman running from the tiger thing that's highly overused as an example, but it's an image we can all get behind, right? We can all see that in our mind's eye. The truth is the amygdala was especially helpful for our ancestors, and it's incredibly hijacking for us today as evolved humans. There's a reason why it's so hijacking for us right now, and I want to explain that because when the amygdala senses trouble is afoot, it sends out an SOS to the nervous system, and we often spring into action without even being aware of what's going on. I like to call these actions and reactions borrowing trouble. We have air quotes there. I'll explain why in just a moment. But when this SOS fires and the nervous system gets activated, stress hormones flood our body and we hit a state of high alert. You actually know the name of that state of high alert. Many people are using it now. It's a thing that people are using sort of as an excuse. Well, I was in fight, flight, or freeze, and so it wasn't my fault. Right? You've heard that. And we all experience this. And sadly, many people do live in a state of fight, flight, and or freeze. I said and or because we can actually move through all three of these in a moment's notice because we live from this space of heightened awareness, stress, this frame of mind and living that's incredibly tense, right? And we feel it in our body, in our thinking, and the way we feel, in pretty much everything. I like to call the amygdala our threat detector of the brain, right? Because it helps us either get away, to fight back, or to play dead. Most of us live our lives like that, right? We're running away from things that feel dangerous, but may not be. We really refuse to think or address things that don't feel good. We fight ourselves. We borrow trouble mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and sometimes financially. And there are times that we play dead emotionally because we don't want to deal. We refuse action in our lives. We don't allow ourselves to work on ourselves until really shit hits the fan, excuse the expression. And sometimes we completely stand still instead of doing what we need. When this happens, most often, The amygdala has hijacked the brain. This ability to hijack the brain is a great trick if our survival depends on it. But in general, the kinds of threats that our amygdala is experiencing on a day-to-day is really far less perilous and more symbolic, right? Like people cutting us off in traffic or seeing someone's face that gives us a nasty look and all of a sudden we feel like we're in trouble, right? That's far less perilous than a tiger coming to get us. And yet the amygdala knows no difference. The bad news is that the threat detector isn't so great at telling the difference between a real threat, such as a life-threatening scenario, and a situation that absolutely doesn't deserve our attention, our reaction, our time, and most certainly our energy. Sometimes we become triggered in a moment and perceive a threat, and how we navigate our experiences and our emotions become a liability. And that's really what I want to talk about today when we're triggered into action and what it does to us long term. And why? Why does that happen? I was literally in a moment like this yesterday, and this is a true story. I want to share it with you because I think it's very important to understand how quick a trigger can unfold. So I ran to Costco yesterday. That's a massive warehouse store for groceries, home goods, pharmaceuticals, and everything in between if you're outside of the United States. And as I was walking out, I was hugging the line of parked cars because where I had parked was up against the building and the parking lot was filled with people pushing carts and passing cars, and there just wasn't a whole lot of space. As I was making my way to my car, the man that was parked next to me began to back up without even looking, and he hit me. Literally, as I was standing on my feet, he hit my physical body. I am okay. All right. I'm totally fine. He was backing out at literally maybe 1 mile an hour. It was enough, though, to move the cart and to put me into fight mode. And I can tell you, I had this real sense that took over that I needed to defend myself. If it wasn't enough to get hit by the car, the man then jumps out and starts screaming at me. He's yelling in my face. He's really literally inches from me. And again, remember, I'm already in defense mode. And he's yelling, "How could you be so stupid? Don't you watch out for cars?" He was calling me a host of names. And let's just say I didn't keep my cool. I found myself standing my ground, right? I was trying to really protect myself. I felt like I was in danger. And remember, I was already in fight mode, so I yelled back. And yes, my normal, cool, calm, and, mindful self lost it. It was ugly. And when it was all said and done, it took me a bit to calm down because guess what? I was triggered. There's that word again, triggered. So what is a trigger? We're going to pause the story for just a moment. A trigger is a stimulus, right? So an event, an emotion, a mental situation that elicits a reaction. That's really all a trigger is. We try to make it into something so much bigger than it is, but that's what a true trigger is. And of course, there are many different types of triggers, and being triggered is a unique experience to all of us. So let's break it down into a simpler thought. A trigger disrupts our ability to remain in the present moment. Was I in the present moment when the altercation was occurring? And the answer is no. My mind was caught in the moment a few seconds before he jumped out of the car when I was trying to make a very critical decision, either be hit by the car that was backing out or jump into the line of traffic that was going much faster. In these moments, the triggering situation can bring up very specific thoughts around safety or a past experience and emotion, and that can influence our behaviors. Like we've already talked about, the amygdala is sending you out to the wild of your reactions without understanding what you're doing, and the trigger can bring up really unpleasant feelings and thoughts. Triggers are both internal and external, and unfortunately, not a single one of us are in control of what we lock and store in the brain. We haven't gotten into a place where we fully understand the brain's design, and when it comes to triggers, we're not even quite sure how they're fully formed. But we do have research that suggests the brain may store our memories from big moments or traumatic moments or things that caused us to go into fight, flight, or freeze very differently than we do everyday events or moments. When we become triggered, the brain grabs a hold of something that's similar to the past, even if there's not a true link between the moment you're experiencing and the past event or feeling that's being brought up. The brain interprets the past event as if it's happening right now, and all of those feelings, all of those situations come rushing back and are added to the moment you're having, right? So, of course, there are situations where we react and we're like, why did we respond so big? Why did we respond that way? It wasn't that deep, and that is why. So at the moment of the car hitting me, my mind immediately went back to my dad yelling at me, grabbing my arm, picking me up by my shoulder, and putting me back on a curb when I was around 4 years old, right? I had stepped off a curb without looking or holding his hand, and when I did, I nearly walked into oncoming traffic. Did my dad overreact? No, he didn't. My dad was triggered in that moment. He was actually hit by a car when he was a child, broke both his legs, messed up his back, and did a ton of bodily damage. He was triggered, right? That brought up something for him. So inside my memory bank at that moment, I pulled up a memory that was nearly 40 years old. There I was, being yelled at by a man I did not know in a Costco parking lot, and it was as if 4-year-old little me was being yelled at. Talk about being triggered. I only offer you this experience, this moment that I personally experienced, because this is exactly how this happens. All is well, something happens, and boom, we are reacting, trying to maintain our emotional, mental, and physical safety. Unless we have tools to break it down, we sometimes have no idea, and I mean no idea, why we are responding the way we are. You see, the amygdala perceives threats based on what we have locked in, right? 4-year-old me coming out 40 years later, it's a big thing. When we start to feel a certain feeling, need, or desire that has a similar feeling to something prior, that's when things get bad. Even when the amygdala doesn't gauge the moment with 100% accuracy, it still sounds the alarm and we have a reaction. Have you ever heard of the term quick to anger? This is a huge part of living in a state of fight, flight, or freeze with all of our triggers hanging out and waiting to take part of our day. So let's talk about a few examples of triggers. This is not a master list, right? I don't want you to think that. These are not the only triggers that are out there. These are just a few examples because you need to know that triggers come in all sizes and shapes and are unique to just you and vary due to your personal degree of trauma and experience. It also varies depending on your emotional intelligence. So here are a few examples. Holidays and anniversaries of traumas or losses. Those can be huge triggers. Certain sounds, sights, smells, and taste that are related to an event or trauma. Remember, too, we have to go back to what trauma really means, and that means any experience for any reason that we connect to in a negative way. All right, so it can be anything. So what may be traumatic to you may just be uncomfortable to me, so we can't judge other people's triggers or even our own. There's no comparison here. Back to our triggers list, loud voices and noises as well as yelling can be a trigger. Arguments, being ridiculed or judged, being alone or feeling lonely, being rejected or ignored. A breakup of a relationship is often a massive trigger for women. Violence on the news, sexual harassment, unwanted touching, assault, physical illness or injury. These are all triggers. We're going to leave it there. But just know that anything can be a trigger if you have already locked a pattern away in your mind. The hardest part of all of this for most people is that once a trigger occurs, so your buttons have been pushed, your default brain programming takes over in literally a nanosecond. It's insane how fast this occurs. Once people understand this, the next natural thing is, but why? Right? That's the question. Why? Why does this happen and how can I get out of it? That's the biggest question that comes in sessions. It's like, okay, I can understand it. I can roll with the fact that this is happening, but how do I make it stop? Can I get out of it? Yes, you can. We're going to explore that in just a moment. But let's talk about the purpose of a trigger first, because I think that's just as important. And the purpose of any trigger is to act as a warning. I want you to think about it. If your brain's number one job is safety and the amygdala is always scanning every moment for anything unsafe, the brain would then be naturally wired to keep you alert. And that alertness comes as an impulse. A warning is energy, right? It's bringing forth information. That's an impulse. So the purpose is to tell you, hey, something's not right here. Something that is occurring does not feel good. It's not making me, respond in a positive way. It's nothing more than a warning. Does any of that make it any easier to be in these moments where your brain is literally hijacking you and you're finding yourself reacting in a way that isn't so becoming? You are really definitely borrowing trouble, or maybe even irrationally lashing out. Of course, the answer is no, not at all. So what can we do? Right back to the how do I get out of this? What can we do to stay in control, calm the amygdala, regulate our nervous system, and stay out of that nasty beast of fight, flight, or freeze if it's truly not needed? Again, truly not needed, meaning you're not in danger, right? There's not an impending situation that will cause you mental, physical, or emotional harm, okay? So meaning that I'm reacting to a moment and I shouldn't necessarily be reacting the way that I am. Okay, so that part of the trigger is what we're talking about. In order to stop the amygdala from hijacking us, we have to bring in another part of our supercomputer that many of us truly fail to use day to day unless we practice and live mindfully. So, what is this part? I like to call this the observer of the brain, but its actual name is prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that helps us see, watch, and identify what's happening around us and within us. Now, I already told you that I was triggered in the parking lot when being hit. I consider myself a highly mindful person, right? I am generally in complete control of how I show up. But generally, not always, but most of the time. However, my observer still did not take over in the very beginning of this exchange, no matter how mindful I am. It did kick on about midpoint if I look back and watch how my reactions unfolded. But this part, kicking on the prefrontal cortex when we are triggered, is a practice skill. It's a practice brain function. For many people, this is not automatic. So let's get into that, right? How to do it, because I want you to be able to get yourself out of all those triggers and the daily heightened stress responses and all of these feelings that really do not serve you. I like to teach being in the observer part of your brain in a very specific way. I've heard many therapists actually do this process in a very different way. And it's basically like imagining you're holding the situation and you can move your hands back and forth, so closer or further out to give you new perspective. I think that's fine, but for me, that doesn't really work. I'm more of a visual person, so this doesn't really drive that visualization process for me. However, using that thought of visualization, I want you to place yourself inside a movie theater. Like you are watching your singular event or your feeling or your experience or even a thought playing out on this movie screen in front of you. And let it, unfold just the way that it's happening in the moment. And what's happened, if you can get into that visualization, is you have separated yourself from the feeling. And instead, you are watching, right? We're talking about the observer part of the brain. When we observe something, we're watching, we're not thinking. And that's so important. If you watch something happen, you can actually see the moment from different angles or different points of view as it unfolds. And this gives us perspective. So we really want to get into that place where we are experiencing the trigger, but we can hold space for ourselves to really check in. How do I feel? How am I experiencing this moment? And if we can ask those questions, we can deactivate the automatic responses. That's so important, right? We can take down the stress and we can tell the amygdala, hey, you know what? We don't need you right now. We're safe. We're not in danger. And that allows us to turn on the rational thinking part of the brain. Because once the amygdala is in fight, flight, or freeze, or it is trying to keep us in a space where we are completely safe, logic, it's gone, right? Most of the time, logic is gone when we are in those moments. So instead of being completely absorbed in our distress, we can step out of it just long enough to stop, see the moment, objectively for just a moment, and then we can amplify and put our emotional intelligence into full action. And that is so needed. When we hold space and observe, we can then do what I always talk about, which is to get down to just the facts. This is a very important part of that. I personally feel that this practice alone is a game changer for personal peace, and it truly is a radical act of self-love. We can de-escalate ourselves. We can literally slow down just enough that we can identify what we're feeling, why we are feeling it, name the emotion, ask ourselves why we're experiencing it, and then shift our power back to the logical mind. I'm going to slow that down in just a moment and give you the steps. Don't worry. But, when we are able to see what's happening, we avoid the hijacking and we avoid the old programming, otherwise known as triggers. This is how we disentangle ourselves. I just went through a lot with you, and so I'm going to break it down even further, like what I just said. So many of you ladies write in and tell me how much you love the steps that I give you. So I'm going to give you a step-by-step coping mechanism or exercise to get beyond your triggers. And hopefully, if you practice this enough outside of a triggering event, when you do become triggered, it is a much shorter event and not an all-day or even all-week marathon, right? That is such a hard place to be in when something dysregulates us so much. We are so triggered that we spend days and days and days harping on it, complaining, being upset, right? We don't want to be in that space. So, step one, it's really simple. Okay, it's not actually simple, but it's something I want you to practice, okay? Step one is to stay present in your daily life, in your day. I want you to stay present. We are far more likely to be triggered when we are mindless, okay? Of course, we can be triggered when we are completely mindful. Look what happened at Costco, right? However, when we are present moment aware, we are much more likely to be in this moment, and when situations roll downhill, we will not find ourselves overreacting because we're at the mercy of our mind. I probably should say that again. When we are mindful, when a situation rolls downhill, we do not find ourselves overreacting because we are not at the mercy of our mind. So, what does that mean? It means you have to practice staying present. That sounds like a lot of work. When I first start shifting people into present moment thinking, I ask them to practice something very simple, and it is present moment awareness. I'm talking less than 60 seconds, okay? When we practice moment awareness through observation, what happens? We're telling the amygdala we are safe, okay? And this is very important. So you can do this when you walk out of a store. You can visually scan the parking lot and play a little game of I Spy with yourself. So you kind of scan the parking lot and you take in the details. There's tons of trees in the back corner. They're tall. They're losing their leaves. There are 10 rows of parking spaces, and each row is nearly full. The first car in the first row is white, right? So This is the way to actively observe your surroundings. If you're doing this, you're in the moment, you're in the experience. It's easy, it's quick, it doesn't take a long time, but this helps the brain use that as a normal pattern no matter where you are. It's you telling your brain, I'm here right now and I am actively engaging in the experience. It's not you walking with your head down looking at your phone. It's you engaging with the environment around you. So important. And this really does help us to not be triggered. So, step 2, should you feel a trigger come up, step back and become aware that you are triggered. Is this easy? No, it is a practice. I want you to practice this and really get into a place where you are constantly assessing your emotional state. And that seems like a lot of work, and it is, right? But it's checking in. You should be checking in with yourself throughout the day anyway, right? So if you're not doing that, start checking in. How do I feel? Oh, I had a hard last hour. Okay. Can I name what was so hard? What emotion I am feeling? Well, I'm angry. I didn't like the way that went. Okay. Why? Because it didn't feel good. Well, why? Because it was unsafe. Someone was yelling at me. Oh, okay. Well, how do I really want to respond in that moment? I want to yell back. Will that help? No, it won't help. It actually may cause a bigger problem. What's going on here? I'm triggered. I'm not feeling good. But I can acknowledge that I'm experiencing an emotional or mental disturbance and that I have a choice right here, right now, to either react or respond. The goal is not to let the thought or the emotion become so overstimulating or long-term that it causes me to tank emotionally, mentally, and or physically. Because all of those things can happen when we are triggered. It doesn't just have to be one thing. Remaining aware that I am not my thoughts, that you are not your thoughts, that I am not my emotions, you are not your emotions, will help you remain detached and not immediately needing to react based on a trigger, a past experience. Just having a little bit of perspective, having a little bit of space will allow you to remain more in control. And that's where we want. We don't want to try to control the moment, but we do want to try to control how this trigger may take over. Okay? So step 3, like I said, try to have some perspective. As soon as you feel that trigger coming up, really get into that situation where you are trying to have a bird's eye view, right? Remember, you're back into the movie theater where you're watching the moment on the screen. Or if the example of looking at it and putting it in your hands and moving it away from you works, do that too. But as soon as you recognize that there are intense feelings coming in, remember to take some perspective. What do I need to know about this moment? Are there other points of view in this moment? How is this moment going to serve me or not? And get into a place where you're looking from different angles. Step 4, remind yourself that you are safe. Remember, the reason why the amygdala is trying to give you a signal to warn you that there is a problem is because it thinks that you are unsafe. So remind yourself, I am safe. I do have to say that this will not immediately deactivate the trigger. So I want you to know that. Reminding yourself that you are safe does not immediately shut it down. However, you can provide yourself with evidence that you are safe, and that begins to slow the reaction down. And that could be, again, naming the emotion that's coming up and saying, I am not this emotion. I am not anger. All is well. I am okay. I'm in my home. I'm not in this past experience. It's really giving yourself the understanding that things are happening within me. However, there are more alternatives to the moment, right? I am safe. I'm okay. Step 5, identify what preferences, emotions, or needs are not being met at the moment. What does this mean? It means a trigger may arise because, say, you're cut off in traffic and you feel like you are never respected. Maybe you had a really bad day at the office and you're trying to go home and somebody cuts you off. and you are at the point of breaking. Okay, so you have been triggered. I am upset. I want you to begin to break down what you would rather have happen in the moment. This is also a very good way of telling the brain that you are safe. So I'm in traffic, I get cut off. I would prefer to not be in traffic right now. So that's my preference. So you begin to speak out loud what your preferences are, what your needs are that need to be met. I would prefer that other people treat me with kindness. I would prefer to not feel unsafe by the actions of others. We can learn to be more tolerant of our emotions and our triggers if we have an idea of how to get into a space of what we would like to happen instead of simply and merely reacting. Okay? We do that so often. We just fly off the handle, snap of a finger, we are done, and that makes most situations worse. What do I need? What do I want? How am I going to get there? There again are those questions that I ask all the time and with good reason. So the last step, right, the most important part, I think, is to decide in the moment or even after the moment if you're going to grow through the trigger or are you simply going to strive to avoid them? Most people avoid triggers, and they do it because they think it's too hard to break. And any time that you practice something else in lieu of a pattern, which is a trigger, right? Something we've told our brain, this is how we're going to respond. We begin to change the pattern. We begin to change the trigger. And so, of course, we don't want to run. We want to strive to break down what is happening. And so we begin asking ourselves, whose responsibility is this? Is this my feeling to address? Is this moment mine to address? What do I need to do to take action so that I have some responsibility in how I'm feeling? That doesn't mean that you have to take responsibility for a moment. It simply means I'm taking responsibility for how I feel. You can use your time to roll around in negatives and low-lying energy, or you can choose to see moments, your thoughts, your feelings, and everything else as energy you're putting out into the world. And if you're putting out negative energy, you have the choice to change it. If you are triggered by all these other things, you have a choice to decide, what's the opposite of this? What can I do that would make me feel opposite of how I'm feeling right now? And then lean into that. You always have a choice. And doing that allows you to have self-compassion and acceptance. Plus, it builds on awareness. It's telling the brain, I am safe. I am fine in this moment. As for these steps, some triggers respond to them without question, and it's super easy to navigate. There are others that are really massive that are much more difficult and you need more tools. Okay, so I want you to know that. This is not a one-size-fits-all step-by-step. Sometimes I can give you those, but it's not fair to say that when we're talking about the brain. Okay, so don't get lost in it and you're trying it and it doesn't work and you're like, I don't know why I even listened to her. Just know that sometimes things are a little bit bigger than us and we need a little bit more help, some more in-depth tools, right? That's what therapists are here for. The point of all of this is your brain is always trying to keep you safe. It's doing everything it can to help you think, feel, and do your very best and be your very best. But sometimes we have experiences that we lock in that would be best to not experience again later on. We always must stay present, use the emotions to our benefit, and every moment to our benefit. The goal isn't to try to enjoy every moment that happens, right? That's impossible, and it really is in that toxic positivity line of things. It's not possible. The goal here is to allow space between yourself and a moment. It's to allow space between feeling and your safety. It's to allow space between the moment and your reaction. It's really to allow space between you and the unwanted. And when you get there, when you're able to do it, again, not 100% of the time. It's not going to happen 100% of the time. So let's take that expectation off the table. But when you are not living in active response, stress, fight or flight, freeze, when we're terribly dysregulated because of a situation, it's then that you disentangle yourself from the things that have never been able to serve you. That's growth, isn't it? Isn't that the real set of how we are trying to show up? Isn't that personal power? Isn't it using your power to your benefit? It really is. We all have triggers. We all get triggered. We are all subject to the amygdala going a little sideways and taking us down a path that we don't absolutely love. But we all have choices, and we all have the ability to show up to any situation, regardless if a trigger hits us or not. And doing so, recognizing that there's a choice, is an essential step into getting your life together, girl. Thank you so much for listening to the Get Your Life Together Girl podcast. If you've enjoyed these tips for bettering your life and are seeking daily inspiration, additional tools, and tips, you can follow me on social media at Get Your Life Together Girl on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, or you can visit the show notes, my blog, and my website at getyourlifetogethergirl.com. Please share this episode with friends and family as this helps spread the message to those who may need it. And while you're on my website, go ahead and check out the Get Your Life Together Girl Women's Circle. There's over 100 downloadable tools, and we meet once a month on Zoom as a group setting of women supporting each other. It's such a beautiful experience. I hope to see you there. Until next time, be kind to yourself and others.